The conference room went dead silent. 27 officers, some with decades of service, stared at the young woman standing at attention. Colonel Reeves had asked the simple question, "State your call sign, Lieutenant." Her answer was two words that no one expected to hear again. Two words that belonged to a ghost. Two words that made hardened veterans go pale. Specter 6, sir. This is the story of how Ivy Harris earned a call sign that was never supposed to be spoken again. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out, subscribe now for more. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of RAF Beaumont, casting long shadows across the operations floor. It was the kind of ordinary Tuesday that made you forget you were on a military installation at all. Ivy Harris stood in front of the duty board, her flight suit crisp and new, the fabric still stiff in places where it hadn't yet molded to her frame. At 23, she was one of the youngest reconnaissance pilots to ever graduate from the European Defense Aviation Academy. Her instructors had called her technically brilliant but emotionally unpredictable. A contradiction that followed her like a shadow through every evaluation, every assessment, every conversation about her future in military aviation. She traced her finger along the duty roster, already knowing what she'd find. Training exercises. Equipment checks. Simulator runs. Never the real missions. Never the operations that took pilots beyond the safety of controlled airspace into the uncertain territories where split-second decisions meant the difference between intelligence gathered and lives lost. Looking for your name again, Harris. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Commander Strauss, a veteran pilot with 15 years of active reconnaissance under his belt. He approached with 2 cups of coffee, offering her one with a sympathetic smile that made her stomach tighten. "Just checking the schedule, sir," Ivy replied, accepting the coffee more out of politeness than desire. Strauss glanced at the board, then back at her. "You know they're not going to put you on forward reconnaissance yet. You're too." He paused, searching for the diplomatic word. "Emotional?" Ivy supplied, her voice flat. "Reactive? Unable to maintain professional detachment under pressure?" "I was going to say green," Strauss corrected gently. "But yeah, your psychological evaluations don't exactly inspire confidence when it comes to high-stress operations." Ivy had heard variations of this conversation since her first day at Beaumont. During her final academy assessment, she'd been running a simulated reconnaissance mission when the scenario threw her a curveball: civilian vehicles in a target zone that intelligence had marked as clear. She'd aborted the mission, refused to proceed despite her instructors insisting it was just a simulation, just data on a screen. The emotional response, they'd written in her file, suggests potential liability in real-world operations where calculated risk assessment is essential. Recommended for support roles until psychological resilience can be demonstrated. Support roles. The words that had defined her career so far. She was brilliant at mission planning, exceptional at analyzing reconnaissance data, and absolutely stellar at maintaining equipment. But when it came to actually flying the missions that mattered, she was deemed too emotionally invested, too likely to let feelings override tactical necessity. The briefing room filled gradually as 0800 approached. Ivy took her usual seat near the back, her tablet loaded with the latest intelligence reports she'd compiled overnight. She'd developed a habit of arriving at the operations center at 0500, spending 3 hours analyzing satellite imagery, weather patterns, and geopolitical developments that might affect ongoing missions. Nobody had asked her to do this. It wasn't part of her assigned duties. But Ivy had learned that being indispensable in small ways was sometimes the only path forward when the big opportunities were closed off. Wing Commander Garrett entered precisely on time, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was a legend at Beaumont, a pilot who'd flown more successful deep reconnaissance missions than anyone in the European theater. His face bore the weathered look of someone who'd seen things that aged you faster than years ever could. "Listen up," Garrett announced, pulling up a map on the main display. "We've got a situation developing in the Karpov region. Intelligence suggests unauthorized military buildup near the border. We need eyes on the ground, or rather, eyes from 30,000 feet. The mission designation flashed on screen: Operation Clearview. High-altitude reconnaissance over contested territory, 4-hour flight duration, minimal margin for error. Ivy's pulse quickened as Garrett began assigning roles. Strauss, you're primary pilot. DeWitt, you're running signals intelligence. Patterson, you're on imaging systems. The names continued, each one a reminder of where Ivy stood in the hierarchy. Harris. Ivy straightened at the sound of her name, hope flickering before Garrett's next words extinguished it. You're on mission analysis. I want a complete threat assessment ready before Strauss wheels up. Every potential surface-to-air battery, every radar installation, every flight path variable. You've got 4 hours. 4 hours to prepare someone else for the mission she could fly better than most of the pilots in this room. Ivy nodded curtly, her jaw tight. Yes, sir. As the briefing dispersed, she overheard the familiar whispers that followed her through the corridors of Beaumont. Shame Harris can't actually fly these missions, DeWitt muttered to Patterson. Her tactical analysis is always spot on. Yeah, but analysis from a desk is different from decisions in the cockpit, Patterson replied. Remember what happened during her final academy sim? She froze up because she got too worried about hypothetical civilians. Can't have that kind of hesitation when you're flying over hostile territory. The words stung because they contained truth. Ivy did get emotionally invested. She did think about the human cost of every decision. She did lie awake at night wondering about the families affected by the intelligence her work helped gather. But she'd never believed that caring deeply made her weak. If anything, it made her more careful, more thorough, more determined to get every detail right. Back at her workstation, Ivy pulled up the reconnaissance parameters for Operation Clearview. The Karpov region was a geopolitical nightmare, a border area where 3 nations' interests collided and international law became negotiable. Flying reconnaissance there meant navigating not just physical threats but diplomatic ones. She began building the threat assessment, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she cross-referenced satellite data with signals intelligence and human intelligence reports. Every radar station plotted. Every anti-aircraft battery location verified. Every flight corridor analyzed for risk factors. But as she worked, Ivy found herself going deeper than the assignment required. By the time Ivy finished the threat assessment, 6 hours had passed instead of 4. The operations center had emptied except for the night shift crew monitoring ongoing missions. Her eyes burned from staring at screens, her back ached from hunching over the keyboard, but the document in front of her was something close to perfect. She'd identified 3 optimal flight paths into the Karpov region, each with backup routes and emergency egress options. She'd mapped every threat down to the minute, calculating windows where reconnaissance could be conducted with minimal exposure. She'd even included recommendations for specific imaging settings based on atmospheric conditions and angle of approach. Lieutenant Commander Strauss found her still working at 2,100 hours. Harris, the mission brief was due 6 hours ago. I've been flying on preliminary data. Ivy looked up, startled by how much time had passed. I'm sorry, sir. I wanted to make sure it was complete. Strauss pulled up a chair and began scrolling through her assessment. His expression shifted from impatience to surprise to something approaching awe. This isn't a threat assessment, Harris. This is a complete operational blueprint. You've anticipated variables I wouldn't have thought about until I was already in the air. I just wanted to be thorough, sir. Thorough? Strauss laughed, though not unkindly. You've mapped out contingencies for contingencies. According to this analysis, if I approach from vector 7-3 at exactly 0437 hours, I'll have a 12-minute window where 3 different radar systems create a blind spot. He looked at her with new appreciation. How did you even find that? I cross-referenced the radar rotation patterns with topographical data and historical atmospheric conditions, Ivy explained. The blind spot only exists under specific circumstances, but tomorrow's weather forecast suggests those circumstances will align. Strauss was quiet for a moment, studying the screen. You know what the frustrating thing is, Harris? You think like a pilot. Better than most pilots I know. You see the chess game 3 moves ahead. Then why am I not flying? The question escaped before Ivy could stop it, raw and honest in a way that military protocol discouraged. Strauss's expression softened. Because thinking like a pilot and being a pilot are different things. When you're up there, alone in the cockpit, making decisions in real time with incomplete information, your emotions can't be a factor. Command needs to know you can make the hard calls without hesitation. I can make hard calls, Ivy protested. I make them every day in these assessments. Every recommendation I give could affect whether someone comes home safely. But you're making those calls from here, Strauss gestured around the operations center. With time to think, to analyze, to reconsider. In the cockpit, you get seconds. And according to your academy file, when you got those seconds in simulation, you hesitated. There it was again. That one simulation, that one moment of doubt, defining her entire career trajectory. Ivy had replayed that scenario 1,000 times in her mind. Yes, she'd hesitated. Yes, she'd questioned the intelligence. But she'd also been right to question it. The post-simulation analysis had revealed that the civilian vehicles in the target zone weren't part of the original scenario parameters. They'd been added by an instructor testing her reaction to unexpected complications. Her emotional response had been appropriate. But in a military culture that valued decisive action over careful consideration, appropriate wasn't always valued. Permission to speak freely, sir? Ivy asked. Strauss nodded. Always. That simulation everyone references? The one that supposedly proves I'm too emotional for field operations? I made the right call. The intelligence was flawed. The civilians were real, not hypothetical. My hesitation prevented a simulated catastrophe that would have been a real one if the situation had been genuine. I know, Strauss said quietly. I read the full after-action report. You were right to abort. Ivy felt her breath catch. Then why? Because being right isn't always enough, Strauss interrupted. The military isn't always looking for people who make the right call. Sometimes they're looking for people who make the expedient call. The call that completes the mission regardless of complications. That's insane. That's reality. Strauss stood, collecting the tablet with her threat assessment. Look, Harris, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm going to use every detail of this analysis tomorrow. It's going to make my mission safer and more effective. But it's also going to remind command of exactly what they're wasting by keeping you grounded. By the time Ivy finished the threat assessment, 6 hours had passed instead of 4. The operations center had emptied except for the night shift crew monitoring ongoing missions. Her eyes burned from staring at screens, her back ached from hunching over the keyboard, but the document in front of her was something close to perfect. She'd identified 3 optimal flight paths into the Karpov region, each with backup routes and emergency egress options. She'd mapped every threat down to the minute, calculating windows where reconnaissance could be conducted with minimal exposure. She'd even included recommendations for specific imaging settings based on atmospheric conditions and angle of approach. Lieutenant Commander Strauss found her still working at 2,100 hours. Harris, the mission brief was due 6 hours ago. I've been flying on preliminary data. Ivy looked up, startled by how much time had passed. I'm sorry, sir. I wanted to make sure it was complete. Strauss pulled up a chair and began scrolling through her assessment. His expression shifted from impatience to surprise to something approaching awe. This isn't a threat assessment, Harris. This is a complete operational blueprint. You've anticipated variables I wouldn't have thought about until I was already in the air. I just wanted to be thorough, sir. Thorough? Strauss laughed, though not unkindly. You've mapped out contingencies for contingencies. According to this analysis, if I approach from vector 7-3 at exactly 0437 hours, I'll have a 12-minute window where 3 different radar systems create a blind spot. He looked at her with new appreciation. How did you even find that? I cross-referenced the radar rotation patterns with topographical data and historical atmospheric conditions, Ivy explained. The blind spot only exists under specific circumstances, but tomorrow's weather forecast suggests those circumstances will align. Strauss was quiet for a moment, studying the screen. You know what the frustrating thing is, Harris? You think like a pilot. Better than most pilots I know. You see the chess game 3 moves ahead. Then why am I not flying? The question escaped before Ivy could stop it, raw and honest in a way that military protocol discouraged. Strauss's expression softened. Because thinking like a pilot and being a pilot are different things. When you're up there, alone in the cockpit, making decisions in real time with incomplete information, your emotions can't be a factor. Command needs to know you can make the hard calls without hesitation. I can make hard calls, Ivy protested. I make them every day in these assessments. Every recommendation I give could affect whether someone comes home safely. But you're making those calls from here, Strauss gestured around the operations center. With time to think, to analyze, to reconsider. In the cockpit, you get seconds. And according to your academy file, when you got those seconds in simulation, you hesitated. There it was again. That one simulation, that one moment of doubt, defining her entire career trajectory. Ivy had replayed that scenario 1,000 times in her mind. Yes, she'd hesitated. Yes, she'd questioned the intelligence. But she'd also been right to question it. The post-simulation analysis had revealed that the civilian vehicles in the target zone weren't part of the original scenario parameters. They'd been added by an instructor testing her reaction to unexpected complications. Her emotional response had been appropriate. But in a military culture that valued decisive action over careful consideration, appropriate wasn't always valued. Permission to speak freely, sir? Ivy asked. Strauss nodded. Always. That simulation everyone references? The one that supposedly proves I'm too emotional for field operations? I made the right call. The intelligence was flawed. The civilians were real, not hypothetical. My hesitation prevented a simulated catastrophe that would have been a real one if the situation had been genuine. I know, Strauss said quietly. I read the full after-action report. You were right to abort. Ivy felt her breath catch. Then why? Because being right isn't always enough, Strauss interrupted. The military isn't always looking for people who make the right call. Sometimes they're looking for people who make the expedient call. The call that completes the mission regardless of complications. That's insane. That's reality. Strauss stood, collecting the tablet with her threat assessment. Look, Harris, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm going to use every detail of this analysis tomorrow. It's going to make my mission safer and more effective. But it's also going to remind command of exactly what they're wasting by keeping you grounded. The alarm jolted Ivy awake at 0430. For a moment, she lay in the darkness of her quarters, disoriented by the urgency in the sound. This wasn't her usual wake-up call. This was the emergency recall signal that meant something had gone catastrophically wrong. She dressed in 90 seconds and sprinted across the base toward the operations center. The morning air was cool and still, the sky beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Other personnel were converging on the building from various directions, their faces tight with concern. Wing Commander Garrett stood at the center of organized chaos when Ivy entered. Radios crackled with urgent chatter, screens displayed tracking data that made her blood run cold, and the tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Status update, Garrett demanded, his voice cutting through the noise. Strauss is 30 minutes overdue for scheduled check-in, Lieutenant DeWitt reported from the communications station. Last confirmed position was entering Karpov airspace. We've lost all telemetry. Ivy's stomach dropped. Strauss was flying the mission she'd planned, using the threat assessment she'd spent 14 hours perfecting. If something had gone wrong, if she'd missed something critical in her analysis, then his disappearance was partially her responsibility. Any signals intelligence suggesting hostile action? Garrett asked. Negative, sir, DeWitt replied. No radar lock warnings, no missile launch detection, nothing. He just went silent. Garrett turned to his senior staff, his expression grim. Options. I need options now. We could send another reconnaissance aircraft to search his projected flight path, suggested Major Flynn, the deputy operations officer. But without knowing what happened to Strauss, we'd be risking another pilot. What about satellite imagery? Someone else proposed. Weather systems are blocking most visual observation, DeWitt answered. We'd need assets we don't have immediate access to. Ivy found herself moving forward before conscious thought caught up with her actions. Sir, request permission to speak. Garrett's eyes found her in the crowded room. Harris, not now. Sir, I planned Strauss's mission profile. I know every kilometer of his projected route, every contingency, every alternate landing site. If he's down, I can narrow the search parameters. You're not search and rescue, Lieutenant. You're reconnaissance analysis. Which makes me the person who best understands where he might have diverted if he encountered trouble, Ivy pressed, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Give me 10 minutes with the last known data. I can give you a search zone that's actually feasible. Garrett studied her for a long moment, then jerked his head toward a workstation. 10 minutes. Make them count. Ivy practically dove into the chair, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she pulled up Strauss's flight data. She overlaid it with her threat assessment, looking for discrepancies, for moments where the actual flight path deviated from her recommendations. There. At timestamp 0443, Strauss had altered course slightly, moving 2 degrees north of the optimal vector she'd calculated. It was a minor deviation, the kind of adjustment pilots made constantly based on real-time conditions. But combined with the atmospheric data she'd analyzed, that 2-degree shift would have put him directly in the path of an unexpected weather cell. She cross-referenced historical emergency landing data for the region, factoring in fuel consumption rates, glide ratios, and terrain features. The search zone began to crystallize in her mind, narrowing from hundreds of square kilometers to a manageable area. Sir, she called out, her voice cutting through the ongoing debates. If Strauss encountered severe weather at his last known position and had to make an emergency landing, there are only 3 locations within his remaining fuel range that offer suitable terrain. She threw the map onto the main display, highlighting 3 zones. Here, here, and here. These valleys offer the flattest approach angles and the best chance of survivable emergency landing. If I were flying that route and ran into trouble, that's where I'd aim for. Garrett approached the display, studying her analysis with the practiced eye of someone who'd survived dozens of similar situations. You're assuming he had enough control to aim for anything. If he didn't, we're looking for a crash site, not a rescue, Ivy said bluntly. But Strauss is good. If anyone could dead-stick a reconnaissance aircraft into a controlled landing, it's him. And if he did, he went for one of these 3 locations. The room had gone quiet, everyone watching the exchange between the young lieutenant and the wing commander. Garrett turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable. You're that certain? Ivy met his gaze without flinching. Yes, sir. I'm that certain. Garrett stared at the map for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he turned to Major Flynn. Get search and rescue airborne. Focus on Harris's primary zone first, then expand to the alternates if necessary. Sir, Flynn hesitated. SAR is going to need someone who knows this analysis inside and out to guide the search. Someone who can adjust parameters in real time if the initial zone comes up empty. Then coordinate with Harris from here, Garrett replied. Sir, with respect, coordination from base adds communication lag that could cost lives, Flynn pressed. If Strauss is down and injured, every minute matters. We need someone in the air who can make immediate decisions based on the terrain analysis. Garrett's jaw tightened. Ivy could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, weighing protocol against practicality, risk against necessity. Finally, he turned to her with an expression that made her pulse quicken. Harris, you're rated for multi-engine transport, correct? Yes, sir. current and qualified. But not for combat operations or hostile territory reconnaissance. No, sir. The admission hurt, but lying would serve no purpose. Garrett looked back at the map, then at the clock showing how long Strauss had been missing. Flynn, prep the SAR bird. Harris, you're going as mission coordinator. You'll direct the search from the aircraft, but you do not, under any circumstances, deviate from SAR protocols. Understood? Perfectly, sir. Ivy fought to keep her voice professional, to hide the surge of adrenaline that made her want to sprint to the flight line immediately. 20 minutes later, she was strapped into the observer seat of a utility aircraft, headset on, tablet loaded with her terrain analysis. The pilot, a veteran SAR officer named Lieutenant Voss, ran through pre-flight checks with practiced efficiency. "All right, Harris," Voss said through the intercom. "I'll fly where you tell me to fly, but remember, this is my aircraft. If I say we're breaking off, we're breaking off. No arguments." "Understood, Lieutenant." The aircraft lifted off into the pale morning sky, banking east toward the Karpov region. As they climbed, Ivy studied the terrain maps on her tablet, cross-referencing with real-time weather updates. The storm system that had likely forced Strauss down was dissipating, but visibility remained marginal in the valleys. Coming up on the border, Voss announced. "Radio discipline from here on. If we pick up any hostile signals, we're out immediately." Ivy acknowledged and focused on the ground below. The landscape transformed from the controlled patterns of civilization to the wild, rugged terrain of the border region. Mountains rose like ancient sentinels, their peaks shrouded in morning mist. "First search zone in 5 minutes, Voss continued. "Talk me through what we're looking for." "Valley running northwest to southeast," Ivy replied, her eyes scanning the terrain. "Wide enough for emergency landing approach, relatively flat floor. If Strauss made it here, he'd be in the northern section where the valley widens." The aircraft descended, flying low enough that Ivy could make out individual trees and rock formations. Her heart hammered as they traced the valley, searching for any sign of the missing reconnaissance aircraft. "Nothing. Zone 1 is negative," Voss said after 30 minutes of systematic searching. "Moving to Zone 2. The second location was farther east, a high plateau that offered better visibility but more exposed landing conditions. Ivy directed Voss through a search pattern that covered every possible approach angle. Again, nothing. "Harris, we're burning fuel," Voss warned. "We've got maybe 45 minutes before we need to head back." "Zone 3, Ivy said, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. "It's the most likely location anyway. Better terrain, closer to his last known position." As they approached the third valley, Ivy felt something shift in her chest. This was it. This had to be it. She'd analyzed every variable, considered every possibility. If Strauss was alive, he was here. "There," she suddenly shouted, pointing at a glint of metal partially obscured by trees. 11 o'clock, near the tree line. Voss banked hard, bringing the aircraft around for a closer look. Through the clearing mist, they could see it, Strauss's reconnaissance aircraft, intact but clearly damaged, sitting at an angle in a small clearing. "I've got visual confirmation," Voss reported to base. "Aircraft appears intact. No visual on pilot yet." Ivy's hands were shaking as she scanned the area around the downed aircraft. Then she saw movement, a figure emerging from the tree line, waving frantically. "Pilot confirmed alive," she reported, her voice breaking slightly with relief. "Strauss is mobile." The rescue operation took 3 hours. Strauss had managed a controlled emergency landing after severe weather damaged his navigation systems, but the terrain made extraction complicated. Ivy coordinated between Voss, the ground recovery team that arrived via helicopter, and base command, directing operations with the same meticulous attention to detail she brought to her analysis work. By the time they returned to Beaumont, the sun was high in an ordinary sky, making the morning's drama seem almost surreal. Strauss was bruised and exhausted but otherwise unharmed. Medical cleared him within an hour. Ivy was filing her mission report when he found her in the operations center. His flight suit was replaced with standard fatigues, but he still moved with the stiffness of someone who'd had a very bad day. "You found me," he said simply. "You made it easy," Ivy replied, trying for levity. "You landed exactly where my analysis predicted you would." Strauss pulled up a chair, wincing slightly. "Harris, do you understand what you did today? You built a search pattern that turned an impossible needle-in-haystack operation into a targeted rescue. You saved my life." "I just analyzed the data, sir." "No," Strauss interrupted firmly. "You thought like a pilot in trouble. You understood what I would do, where I would go, how I would react. That's not analysis. That's empathy. That's the emotional intelligence everyone keeps telling you is a weakness." Ivy looked up from her report, surprised by the intensity in his voice. "I'm going to tell command something," Strauss continued. "I'm going to tell them that the officer who found me today should be flying reconnaissance, not just analyzing it. I'm going to recommend you for active flight operations. Sir, with respect, you know my academy record. You know what they'll say." "I know what I'll say," Strauss countered. "That you proved today you can make critical decisions under pressure. That your emotional investment in getting things right isn't a liability, it's your greatest asset. That the military needs pilots who care about bringing everyone home." Before Ivy could respond, Wing Commander Garrett entered the operations center. His expression was unreadable as he approached them. "Lieutenant Harris, my office." "Now." Ivy's stomach dropped. She followed Garrett through the corridors to his private office, her mind racing through everything that had happened. Had she overstepped? Made a decision that violated some protocol she'd overlooked? Garrett closed the door and gestured to a chair. Instead of sitting behind his desk, he took the chair next to hers, his posture less formal than she'd ever seen. "I've been a military aviator for 23 years, he began. "I've seen pilots with perfect technical skills wash out because they couldn't handle the pressure. I've seen officers with flawless records make catastrophic decisions because they stopped thinking and started reacting." Ivy waited, unsure where this was going. "And I've seen promising officers held back because they didn't fit someone's narrow definition of what a pilot should be," Garrett continued. "Your father was one of those officers, early in his career." Ivy's breath caught. "You knew my father?" "Flew with him in his first operational squadron. Thomas Harris was the most cautious, analytical, emotionally invested pilot I ever met. Drove our squadron commander crazy because he questioned everything, wanted to understand every variable before committing to a decision. What changed?" "He got his chance to prove that careful wasn't the same as weak," Garrett said. "And once he did, he became the pilot everyone wanted on their wing. The one who brought everyone home because he cared too much to accept unnecessary risks." Garrett stood and moved to his desk, pulling out a file. "I'm putting you forward for advanced reconnaissance training. Full operational qualification. You'll fly the same missions you've been analyzing from the ground." Ivy felt her world tilt. "Sir, my academy record." "Your academy record shows one questionable simulation performance weighed against 3 years of exceptional analysis work and today's successful rescue coordination," Garrett interrupted. "I'm choosing to weight the evidence differently than your instructors did." "Sir, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything yet," Garrett replied. "Because there's a condition. Before you can be cleared for operational status, you need a call sign. Tradition dictates that your squadron assigns it, but given your unique situation, I'm asking you to choose your own." Ivy sat in the mess hall that evening, a cup of tea growing cold in front of her while she stared at a blank piece of paper. Around her, the usual evening bustle of the base continued, pilots and support staff grabbing dinner between shifts, but she barely noticed. A call sign. She needed a call sign. In military aviation culture, call signs were sacred. They were identity, reputation, and history compressed into a single word or phrase. Some pilots earned them through spectacular achievements. Others got stuck with them after embarrassing incidents. But they all meant something, reflected something essential about who you were in the cockpit. Lieutenant DeWitt sat down across from her uninvited. Heard you're getting your wings. Congratulations. Thanks, Ivy replied absently, still staring at the paper. Call sign giving you trouble? DeWitt gestured at the blank page. How do you choose something that defines you when you haven't even flown your first real mission yet? DeWitt sipped his coffee thoughtfully. Most pilots don't choose their call signs. The squadron picks something based on your first major screw-up or your most embarrassing moment. But Garrett giving you the choice? That's unusual. That's saying your call sign should reflect who you already are, not who you'll become. After DeWitt left, Ivy walked out to the flight line. The reconnaissance aircraft sat in neat rows, their sleek forms catching the last rays of evening sun. She thought about her father, about the careful pilot who'd become legendary. She thought about Strauss, about finding him when everyone else thought it was impossible. She thought about all the missions she'd analyzed, all the details she'd memorized, all the nights she'd stayed late preparing for opportunities that never came. And then she thought about the call sign no one had spoken at Beaumont in 7 years. Specter 6 had belonged to her father. It was the call sign he'd earned after a mission where he'd brought home 5 other aircraft through conditions that should have been impossible to navigate. He'd been the 6th aircraft, the one everyone else followed, the one that seemed to appear out of nowhere when things went wrong. The call sign had been retired when he died, a mark of respect. No one was supposed to use it again. It belonged to history, to memory, to a pilot who'd set a standard that felt unreachable. Ivy pulled out her phone and called her mother in Vienna. Mom, I need to ask you something about Dad. They talked for an hour. Her mother told stories Ivy had never heard before, about Thomas Harris's early struggles, about the doubts he'd faced, about the mission that had earned him Specter 6. By the end of the call, Ivy knew what her call sign had to be. It was audacious. It was potentially offensive to veterans who'd flown with her father. But it was also honest. The next morning, she walked into Wing Commander Garrett's office with her decision made. He looked up from his paperwork, his expression curious. Have you chosen your call sign, Lieutenant? Yes, sir. Ivy stood at attention, her voice steady. Specter 6, sir. Garrett's expression froze. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stared at her with an intensity that made her wonder if she'd made a catastrophic mistake. Finally, he stood and walked to the window overlooking the flight line. That call sign has been retired for 7 years, he said quietly. Out of respect for your father. I know, sir. Using it could be seen as disrespectful. As if you're claiming to be something you haven't earned. I understand, sir. Garrett turned to face her. Then why? Ivy took a breath, choosing her words carefully. Because my father's legacy isn't just about his achievements. It's about being the pilot who cared enough to bring everyone home. The one who appeared when things seemed impossible. That's what Specter 6 meant to the people who flew with him. And that's what I want it to mean when I fly. You understand you'll be compared to him constantly? That every mission will be measured against his standard? I've been compared to him my entire life, sir. At least this way, I'm defining the comparison on my own terms. Garrett studied her for another long moment, then returned to his desk. He pulled out a form and began filling it in. Your call sign will be entered into the official record today. But before that happens, I'm taking you somewhere. Garrett led Ivy through corridors she'd never accessed before, past security checkpoints that required his command-level clearance. They descended 2 levels below the main operations center, into sections of the base that felt older, more solemn, like walking into a vault of memories. He stopped in front of a door marked Squadron Heritage Room and unlocked it with a physical key, not a card reader. The room beyond was dimly lit, walls lined with photographs, flight suits, and memorabilia from decades of reconnaissance operations. This room holds the history of every significant mission flown from Beaumont, Garrett explained, his voice taking on a reverent tone. Every call sign that's been retired, every aircraft lost, every pilot who made the ultimate sacrifice. He walked to a display case in the corner, and Ivy's breath caught when she saw what it contained. Her father's flight suit, perfectly preserved, the Specter 6 patch still visible on the shoulder. Next to it, photographs from his final mission briefing, his awards, and a handwritten note she'd never seen before. This was found in his personal effects, Garrett said, carefully removing the note from the display. He wrote it the night before his last mission. We've kept it here, but I think you should read it. Ivy took the paper with trembling hands. Her father's handwriting was instantly familiar, the same careful script she remembered from birthday cards and school notes. To whoever follows after me, it began. If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back from whatever mission finally caught up with me. Don't mourn the call sign. It's just a name, just words. What matters is what those words represented, the promise to never leave anyone behind, to never accept that any situation is truly impossible, to care enough about bringing people home that you'll risk everything to make it happen. If someone else wants to carry Specter 6 forward, I hope they understand it's not about living up to my missions. It's about carrying forward the promise. Bring them home. Always bring them home. That's all Specter 6 ever meant. Ivy felt tears threatening but held them back through sheer force of will. Garrett gave her a moment, then spoke quietly. When your father died, we retired the call sign because we thought no one could live up to it. But reading this again, I realize we got it wrong. He didn't want it retired. He wanted it to continue, to mean something beyond his own service. Sir, I don't know if I can live up to. No one can live up to a legend, Garrett interrupted. But you can honor a promise. That's what he's asking for in that letter. Not perfection, not matching his achievements. Just the promise to care enough to bring people home. They stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by the ghosts of missions past. Finally, Garrett carefully returned the letter to its place in the display case. Tomorrow morning, 0800, there's a command briefing with senior officers from 3 different nations, he said, his tone shifting back to official business. New intelligence requirements for the Karpov region. All squadron leaders and senior pilots will be present. You'll be there too. Sir? You're going to announce your call sign to the command staff, Garrett explained. Normally, call signs are informal, internal to the squadron. But Specter 6 isn't normal. If you're going to carry it, everyone needs to know what it means and why you've earned the right. Ivy felt her stomach tighten. Everyone will be there? All the senior officers who knew my father? Yes. Including Colonel Reeves, who was your father's squadron commander. Including General Hartmann, who personally retired the call sign after your father's death. Garrett's expression was serious but not unkind. This isn't meant to be easy, Harris. This is meant to be definitive. When you walk out of that briefing room, either you'll be Specter 6 with everyone's blessing, or you'll need to choose something else. That's not much of a choice, sir. No, Garrett agreed. It's not. But it's the only fair way to do this. The call sign belongs to everyone who flew with your father, everyone who trusted him to bring them home. They deserve to know who's claiming it now and why. That evening, Ivy barely slept. She lay in her quarters staring at the ceiling, rehearsing what she would say, how she would explain her decision. Every scenario she imagined ended with skeptical faces, with questions she couldn't answer, with the crushing weight of expectations she hadn't yet earned the right to meet. At 0600, she gave up on sleep and went for a run around the base perimeter. The morning was cool and clear, the kind of perfect flying weather that made you want to be in the air. She thought about her father, about what he must have felt before his missions, about whether he'd ever doubted himself the way she did now. The briefing room was larger than Ivy had expected, configured more like a small auditorium than a standard meeting space. As she entered at 0755, officers were already taking their seats, conversations humming with the usual pre-briefing energy. She recognized faces from base operations, but there were many she'd never seen before, senior officers with decades of service marked by rows of ribbons and command insignia. Wing Commander Garrett caught her eye and gestured to a seat near the front. As she made her way down the aisle, conversations began to falter. Officers noticed her, the young lieutenant who didn't quite fit the profile of the meeting's usual attendees. Whispers followed in her wake. Colonel Reeves entered at precisely 0800, his presence commanding immediate silence. He was in his late 50s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent more time in cockpits than behind desks. Ivy knew from her father's stories that Reeves had been his mentor, the commander who'd believed in him when others doubted. "Good morning," Reeves began, his voice carrying easily through the room. "We're here to discuss expanded reconnaissance requirements in the Karpov region, but before we begin, Wing Commander Garrett has requested time for a personnel matter." All eyes turned to Garrett as he stood. "Thank you, sir. As many of you know, we recently had a successful rescue operation that demonstrated exceptional analytical and operational capabilities by one of our junior officers. Lieutenant Ivy Harris coordinated the search that located and recovered Lieutenant Commander Strauss after his emergency landing in hostile territory." Polite acknowledgement rippled through the room. Ivy felt her face flush as several officers turned to look at her with new interest. Based on her performance, Garrett continued, "I'm advancing Lieutenant Harris to operational reconnaissance status. She'll be completing advanced qualification and joining active flight rotations." He paused, and the room went very quiet. "She's also chosen her call sign, which is why we're addressing this matter formally rather than through normal squadron channels." Ivy felt every eye in the room focus on her. Her heart hammered so hard she was sure others could hear it. "Lieutenant Harris," Reeves said, his expression unreadable. "Stand and state your chosen call sign." Ivy rose on legs that felt unsteady, turned to face the assembled officers, and took a breath that felt like drawing in the weight of history itself. "Specter 6, sir." The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. Officers who'd been taking notes put down their pens. Those who'd been checking tablets froze. Ivy watched recognition and shock ripple through the room like a shockwave. Colonel Reeves's face had gone pale. Next to him, General Hartmann, a man with silver hair and more combat ribbons than Ivy could count, leaned forward with an expression that might have been anger or disbelief or both. "That call sign," Hartmann said slowly, each word carefully measured, "was retired 7 years ago out of respect for Captain Thomas Harris. Do you understand what you're asking?" "Yes, sir," Ivy replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I'm asking permission to honor my father's legacy by carrying forward the promise that call sign represented." "Your father?" Reeves's voice cracked slightly. He stood, staring at her with sudden intensity. "You're Thomas's daughter?" "Yes, sir." The colonel sat down heavily, as if the revelation had physically impacted him. Other officers began whispering, making connections they hadn't made before. Ivy Harris. Thomas Harris. The resemblance was there if you looked for it, in the shape of her face, the determination in her eyes. "Explain yourself, Lieutenant," Hartmann demanded, though his tone had shifted from anger to something more complex. "Why do you believe you have the right to claim a call sign that belongs to one of the finest pilots this command has ever seen?" This was the moment. Everything depended on what she said next. Ivy took another breath and began to speak, not from rehearsed lines but from the truth she discovered in that heritage room. "Sir, I don't believe I have the right to claim it based on what I've done. I haven't earned it through missions or achievements. But my father left a letter in his personal effects, asking that if anyone wanted to carry Specter 6 forward, they understand what it really meant." Ivy continued, her voice growing stronger as she found her footing. "Specter 6 wasn't about individual achievement. It was about a promise to never leave anyone behind, to never accept that a situation is impossible, to care enough about bringing people home that you'll risk everything to make it happen. That's what I'm asking permission to honor." General Hartmann's expression remained stern. "Pretty words, Lieutenant. But words are easy. Your father proved that promise in a dozen missions where he brought home pilots everyone else had written off. What have you proven?" The challenge hung in the air. Ivy felt the weight of dozens of eyes watching her, measuring her, finding her wanting. She could have mentioned finding Strauss, but that felt inadequate compared to her father's legacy. Colonel Reeves spoke before she could answer. "General, with respect, perhaps we're asking the wrong question. The issue isn't whether Lieutenant Harris has already proven herself to the same standard as her father. The issue is whether we're willing to give her the chance to prove it at all. Explain, Hartman said curtly. Thomas Harris's call sign was retired as a mark of respect, Reeves continued, his voice thick with emotion. But in doing so, we may have dishonored what he actually wanted. I remember the conversations we had before his final mission. He was worried about becoming a legend, about the call sign becoming a monument instead of a living promise. Reeves stood and walked to where Ivy remained at attention. He told me once that the worst thing we could do would be to treat Specter 6 like it died with him. He wanted it to be something other pilots could aspire to, could carry forward, could make their own while holding true to its core meaning. You're suggesting we allow her to use it? Hartman's tone suggested he found the idea problematic at best. I'm suggesting we honor Thomas's actual wishes instead of our grief, Reeves replied. He turned to Ivy. But Lieutenant, you need to understand what you're taking on. Every mission you fly, people will be watching. Every decision you make will be measured against your father's standard. If you fail, if you break that promise even once, it won't just reflect on you. It will tarnish everything your father built. I understand, sir, Ivy said, meeting his gaze directly. But I'd rather carry that weight and honor his memory than let fear keep me from trying. A long silence followed. Finally, Hartman stood, his expression still skeptical but less hostile. Major Griffin, you flew with Captain Harris on multiple missions. What's your assessment? An officer in his 40s stood from the middle of the room. Ivy recognized him from base operations but had never spoken to him directly. Sir, I flew wing for Thomas on the mission that earned him the Specter 6 call sign. I was one of the 5 aircraft he brought home through impossible conditions. Griffin walked down to stand near Ivy, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away. I see Thomas in her. Not just physically, but in the way she approaches problems. The mission planning that found Strauss wasn't lucky guesswork. It was the same meticulous, emotionally invested analysis that made Thomas the pilot everyone wanted on their wing. One successful rescue coordination doesn't make her a reconnaissance pilot, another officer interjected. It certainly doesn't make her Specter 6. No, Griffin agreed. But it demonstrates she has the foundation. The question is whether we're brave enough to let her build on it, or whether we're going to let our attachment to the past prevent someone from honoring it properly. The debate continued for another 20 minutes, officers who'd known her father weighing in with perspectives that ranged from supportive to deeply skeptical. Ivy remained standing through it all, answering questions when asked, accepting criticism when offered, never backing down from her decision. Finally, General Hartman raised his hand for silence. This is an unusual situation requiring an unusual solution. Lieutenant Harris, here's my decision. You may use the call sign Specter 6, but under probationary status. Ivy's heart leaped, but Hartman wasn't finished. You'll fly your first 10 operational missions under direct evaluation. Every decision you make will be reviewed. Every flight plan will be scrutinized. If at any point during those 10 missions you demonstrate that you cannot uphold the standard that call sign represents, it will be permanently retired. Not reassigned. Retired forever. Do you accept those terms? The weight of the conditions settled on Ivy's shoulders. 10 missions where any mistake could end not just her career but her father's legacy permanently. It was more pressure than any junior pilot should face, more scrutiny than was standard for operational qualification. It was also fair. I accept, sir, Ivy said without hesitation. Hartman nodded slowly. Then by my authority as regional commander, I authorize the use of call sign Specter 6 by Lieutenant Ivy Harris, probationary status, pending successful completion of evaluation period. Colonel Reeves, she's assigned to your direct command. If she fails, it's on both of you. Reeves stood at attention. Understood, sir. She won't fail. The briefing moved on to other matters, but Ivy barely heard the discussions about reconnaissance protocols and intelligence requirements. She'd done it. She'd claimed her father's call sign with the blessing, however conditional, of the command staff. but the victory felt less like triumph and more like standing at the base of an impossibly high mountain she'd just committed to climbing. After the briefing, Colonel Reeves intercepted her in the corridor. "Walk with me, Lieutenant." They moved through the base in silence until they reached a small observation deck overlooking the flight line. Reconnaissance aircraft were being prepped for the day's missions, crews moving with practiced efficiency. "Your father and I had a conversation in almost this exact spot," Reeves began, his voice quiet. "It was after his third mission, after he'd made a decision that saved his crew but violated his flight plan. I told him he was too emotional, too invested in outcomes, that he needed to learn to follow orders without questioning them." "What did he say?" "He told me that caring about bringing people home wasn't a weakness, even if it looked like insubordination. He said the day he stopped caring would be the day he became dangerous, not safe." Reeves smiled sadly. "I didn't understand then. I thought he was being naive, that combat operations required cold calculation, not emotional investment. What changed your mind?" "Mission after mission where his emotional investment kept people alive. Where his refusal to accept impossible situations created solutions no one else could see. Your father taught me that there's a difference between emotional decision-making and emotionally invested decision-making. The first is reactive, unreliable. The second is what makes you fight harder, think deeper, refuse to quit when others would." Reeves turned to face her directly. "I see that same quality in you, Ivy. That's why I supported your claim to Specter 6, even knowing how controversial it would be. But I need you to understand something critical. Sir? Your father died because he cared too much. His final mission, the one he didn't come back from, he volunteered for it because everyone else said it was too dangerous. He believed he could bring the pilot back who'd been shot down in hostile territory. He was wrong." The words hit Ivy like a physical blow. She'd never known the specifics of her father's death, only that he'd been lost during a classified operation. "I'm not telling you this to discourage you," Reeves continued. "I'm telling you because carrying Specter 6 means understanding its complete legacy. Your father's greatest strength was also his vulnerability. He never learned when to say a mission was truly impossible, when caring wasn't enough to overcome reality. Are you saying I should be less invested? I'm saying you need to find the balance he never quite managed. Be invested enough to push beyond normal limits, but wise enough to recognize when pushing further means throwing away lives rather than saving them." Reeves's expression softened slightly. "Your first operational mission is tomorrow. 0600 briefing. You'll be flying reconnaissance over the northern Karpov sectors, same route Strauss was running when he went down." Ivy felt her pulse quicken. "Sir, that's considered a high-risk route." "Yes. Which is why I need my most thorough, most emotionally invested, most determined pilot flying it. I need someone who'll plan every detail, consider every variable, and care enough about coming home that they'll make it happen." He extended his hand. "Welcome to operational status, Specter 6. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative." The night before her first operational mission, Ivy couldn't sleep. She lay in her quarters, staring at the ceiling while her mind ran through flight plans, emergency procedures, and weather patterns. At 0300, she gave up on rest and walked to the operations center. The base was quiet at this hour, only essential personnel manning night shifts. Ivy pulled up the mission parameters on her workstation, reviewing details she'd already memorized. Northern Karpov sectors, 4-hour flight duration, intelligence gathering on suspected military installations. The same route that had nearly cost Strauss his life. "You're here early." The voice made her jump. Lieutenant Commander Strauss stood in the doorway, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Figured you might be. Thought you could use this." Ivy accepted the coffee gratefully. "Couldn't sleep." "No one sleeps before their first real mission," Strauss said, pulling up a chair. "I certainly didn't." Spent the whole night convinced I'd forget something critical, make some rookie mistake that would get people killed. How did you deal with it? I reminded myself that fear means you understand the stakes. The pilots who scared me were the ones who weren't afraid, who treated high-risk missions like routine training flights. Strauss pulled up her flight plan on the screen. This is good work, Harris. Thorough, thoughtful, with contingencies for contingencies. Very much like your father's style. Everyone keeps comparing me to him, Ivy said quietly. What if I can't live up to it? Then you'll be like every other pilot who's ever flown, Strauss replied simply. No one lives up to legends. We just do our best and hope it's enough. He stood, preparing to leave. But for what it's worth, you already proved something important when you found me. You proved you can think clearly under pressure, that your emotional investment makes you better, not worse. Trust that tomorrow. The briefing at 0600 was straightforward. Colonel Reeves laid out the mission objectives, weather conditions, and threat assessments. Ivy absorbed every detail, her mind already gaming out scenarios and responses. Other pilots watched her with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. Specter 6, you're clear for departure at 0700, Reeves concluded. Standard protocols, but given the route's history, maintain heightened situational awareness. Any questions? No, sir. Ready to fly. At 0645, Ivy walked to her aircraft. The reconnaissance plane sat gleaming in the early morning light, ground crew completing final checks. She conducted her pre-flight inspection with meticulous care, checking systems her father had probably checked the same way decades before. The crew chief, a veteran sergeant named Holloway, approached as she finished. Lieutenant, this bird's in perfect condition. She'll take care of you if you take care of her. Thank you, Sergeant. Holloway hesitated, then added, I worked on your father's aircraft, back in the day. He had a ritual before every flight. He'd touch the nose cone 3 times, whisper something I could never quite hear, then climb in. Don't know if that helps, but thought you should know. Ivy felt her throat tighten. She walked to the nose cone and pressed her palm against the cool metal 3 times, whispering words only she and the aircraft could hear. Bring them home. Always bring them home. At 0700 sharp, she lifted off into a clear morning sky. The aircraft responded beautifully to her inputs, systems performing exactly as expected. As Beaumont fell away behind her, Ivy felt something shift in her chest. This was real. She was flying reconnaissance, not simulation. Every decision from air forward would matter. The first hour passed smoothly, her flight path taking her along the border region toward Karpov airspace. She maintained constant awareness of her instruments, cross-referencing with the threat assessment she'd memorized. 2 hours in, she crossed into the high-risk zone where Strauss had encountered trouble. Weather conditions were better today, visibility clear for miles. But Ivy remained vigilant, knowing that conditions could change rapidly in these mountains. She began her reconnaissance run, cameras and sensors gathering intelligence on target locations below. That's when her threat warning system lit up. Radar lock, coming from a location her intelligence hadn't identified. Her training screamed at her to evade immediately, to break off and return to base. But something made her hesitate, made her study the signal more carefully. The radar pattern was wrong. Not quite military standard, not quite the signature she'd expect from an active defense system. She had seconds to make a decision, abort the mission as protocols demanded, or investigate what might be a critical intelligence gap. This was the moment that would define everything that followed. Ivy keyed her radio, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Base, Specter 6. I'm showing radar contact at coordinates not in threat assessment. Request confirmation of hostile intent before I abort mission. Specter 6, protocol requires immediate evasion on any radar lock, came the reply from operations. Understood, but the signal characteristics are inconsistent with known defense systems. I'm maneuvering to gather additional intelligence while maintaining escape options. She could almost hear the debate happening in the operations center. She was a probationary pilot on her first mission, questioning protocols, making judgment calls that violated standard procedures. But she was also Specter 6, a call sign built on the promise to push beyond limitations when the situation demanded it. Specter 6, your call. But if this goes wrong, it's on you. Ivy adjusted her flight path, approaching the radar source from an angle that would give her visual confirmation while keeping her outside effective engagement range. Her camera zoomed in on the location, and what she saw made her smile. Not a military installation. A weather monitoring station, recently upgraded with new equipment that happened to emit radar frequencies similar to targeting systems. Important intelligence, but not a threat. She documented the location, gathered detailed imagery, and continued her reconnaissance run. The remaining 2 hours passed without incident. She collected intelligence on all target locations, identified 3 previously unknown facilities that would require further investigation, and returned to Beaumont with a complete data package. As she climbed down from the cockpit, Colonel Reeves was waiting on the tarmac. His expression was unreadable as he approached. "That was an interesting choice you made, Specter 6. Questioning protocols on your first operational mission." "Sir, I assessed the risk and determined that gathering accurate intelligence outweighed the minimal threat presented by what turned out to be a weather station." "And if you'd been wrong? If that radar lock had been hostile? Then I had escape routes planned and would have executed them. But being wrong would have meant aborting a mission based on incomplete analysis, which would have been the greater failure." Reeves studied her for a long moment, then broke into a rare smile. "Your father said almost exactly the same thing to me once. He was wrong that time, by the way. Nearly got himself shot down because he stopped to investigate something that turned out to be a decoy." "Sir? The point isn't that your judgment was perfect today. The point is that you made a judgment call based on analysis and training, not fear or bravado. You cared enough about getting it right to take a calculated risk." Reeves clapped her shoulder. "That's 1 mission down, 9 to go. But I think we both know how this evaluation is going to end." Over the following weeks, Ivy flew mission after mission. Some were routine, others pushed her to her limits. She navigated equipment failures, weather emergencies, and situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between success and catastrophe. Each mission added to her reputation, not as a legend's daughter trying to live up to impossible standards, but as a pilot who brought the same meticulous care and emotional investment to every flight. By her 10th mission, the probationary designation felt like a formality everyone knew would be lifted. She'd proven not just her technical skills but her judgment, her ability to balance her father's caring approach with the wisdom to recognize true limitations. The formal evaluation meeting was brief. General Hartmann reviewed her mission records, consulted with Colonel Reeves and the other officers who'd observed her flights, and made his decision. "Lieutenant Harris, your probationary status is lifted. Call sign Specter 6 is confirmed as your permanent designation. You've earned it not by matching your father's achievements, but by honoring the promise that call sign represents in your own way." 6 months later, Ivy stood in that same briefing room where she'd first claimed her father's call sign. But now she was briefing other pilots, sharing the lessons she'd learned, mentoring younger officers who saw in her proof that caring deeply wasn't a weakness. Wing Commander Garrett approached her after the briefing. "You've become exactly what your father hoped Specter 6 would be. Not a monument to one pilot's legacy, but a living promise that continues to evolve." "I'm just trying to bring people home, sir. 1 mission at a time." "That's all any of us can do," Garrett agreed. "But you're doing it in a way that's changing how this entire command thinks about what makes a great pilot." As Ivy walked out to the flight line for another mission, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. From overlooked logistics officer to operational reconnaissance pilot. From doubted and dismissed to Specter 6. The call sign that had once seemed impossibly heavy now felt like it belonged to her, earned not through her father's achievements but through her own determination to honor the promise it represented. She touched the nose cone of her aircraft 3 times, whispered her ritual words, and climbed into the cockpit. Somewhere above, in the clear sky waiting for her, another mission awaited. Another chance to prove that caring deeply, thinking thoroughly, and refusing to accept impossible were the qualities that truly defined a great pilot. Specter 6 was airborne once again, carrying forward a legacy that would never die as long as someone was willing to fight for the promise, bring them home, always bring them home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.